Again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
Once again, the palace walls have failed to keep a profound family crisis from leaking into the open, shaking the very foundation of the British monarchy. It was not a rumor, nor a whisper shared among courtiers behind polished doors, but a cold reality that made Prince William's blood run cold the moment he looked at the document. He was standing in a quiet room, reading a piece of paper that he believed was completely untouchable. It was Princess Diana's private register, a sacred record containing her personal notes, private wishes, and sensitive memories meant to serve as a voice for a mother who was taken from her sons too soon. For years, this register had been treated as a protected family archive, a sanctuary of truth beyond the reach of palace politics and the changing tides of royal power. William and Harry had grown up inside an institution that demanded absolute silence, even when their grief was still bleeding, and this document was one of the few remaining pieces where their mother's authentic voice survived without being filtered by advisors. But as William examined the page, he noticed a subtle shift in the spacing, a difference in the ink, and a careful replacement of wording that tried far too hard to sound like official palace language. The original sentence, written by Diana to protect her young sons from future household interference and emotional manipulation, had been completely removed and replaced with a cold, sanitized phrase that made her sound less protective and less aware of the dangers surrounding her children. Although Queen Camilla's signature was not written across the page, the unmistakable influence of her household office was pressed between every altered word. In that single frozen second, something inside the Prince of Wales snapped, and the room became unbearably cold. He did not shout, nor did he raise his voice to demand immediate answers from the staff standing nearby. Instead, he simply stood at the long wooden table, reading the altered entry once, and then again, as if his eyes were refusing to accept the betrayal his heart already understood. To William, this was not a simple administrative update or a routine archival correction. It was an act of historical vandalism and a direct violation of his mother's memory. The Queen Consort had stepped into the one sacred chamber of remembrance that William could never forgive anyone for touching, placing herself once again as a barrier between a grieving son and the legacy of his mother. It is highly likely that Camilla did not anticipate the sheer force of the storm she was awakening, perhaps believing that softening the historic language would protect the modern monarchy, reduce old tensions, or remove a phrase that made past palace wounds feel dangerous to her current position. But to the heir to the throne, this was an attempt to edit Princess Diana out of her own history, to bury a mother's warning beneath the weight of controlled institutional language. As the silence in the room deepened, senior aides and archivists waited breathlessly for an explanation that could salvage the situation, but no excuse could form fast enough to heal the damage. William closed the heavy file with both hands, and the sharp sound cut through the palace quiet like a final verdict. His chair moved back with sudden force that made everyone around him freeze in fear. The prince looked toward the door, then back at the altered page, torn between the demands of the institution asking him to stay and protect the family image, and the memory of his mother commanding him to walk away from the hypocrisy. He chose Diana. Within minutes, the Prince of Wales walked out of the palace, leaving behind a wake of panic and a profound fracture that no royal protocol could easily mend. He carried the closed file through the private corridors like a weight heavier than gold, his face controlled but visibly broken by a deep sense of betrayal. It was there, in the quiet hallway, that Catherine found him, his knuckles white as he gripped the cover of the register. He looked at his wife and uttered for words that revealed the depth of his pain, explaining that they had changed his mother's words. Catherine's expression fell instantly because she understood that this was not mere palace drama, but a devastating realization for her son, who discovered that even death could not protect his mother's private voice from being rewritten by the people currently holding power. For years, Camilla had worked tirelessly to secure her place within the royal family, gaining public acceptance one controlled smile and one public appearance at a time. Yet, Diana's enduring memory remained the one door she could never fully open, a shadow she could never truly escape despite her new title as Queen Consort. While the title gave her rank, visibility, and institutional authority, it could never grant her control over the deep affection and loyalty that still belonged exclusively to the late princess. To William, his mother's personal belongings and private writings were not property of the crown. They were emotional sacred ground, and Camilla's office had just stepped directly onto it. King Charles felt the immediate danger of the situation before a single official word was spoken. Caught in an agonizing position between defending his wife and comforting his grieving heir, Charles had spent decades asking his family and the nation to accept Camilla, but he also understood why William viewed the alteration as a total violation of trust. If a protected family register could be quietly altered under the guise of household clarification, then nothing in the royal archives was truly safe from being rewritten to suit the convenience of whoever held power in the future. The crisis quickly escalated beyond a private argument when a documented internal access note revealed that the request to review Diana's register had originated directly from Camilla's household office under a plain-sounding phrase meant to hide the true intent. William's voice remained dangerously low as he confronted the reality of the situation, asking the ultimate question of whether his father had known about the change before it happened. The trigger for this entire confrontation had actually begun weeks earlier during a private event known as the Windsor Legacy Review, a process meant to organize royal archives before the next generation took greater control. It was supposed to be a routine procedural matter, but when an archivist read Diana's original warning aloud, the atmosphere shifted, and the hidden fault lines of the family were exposed once more. Camilla had gripped the arm of her chair in discomfort, recognizing that the late princess's words still held the power to challenge her legitimacy, while Charles had stared at the table in helpless silence. That silence had been interpreted by William as avoidance, and by Camilla as exposure, setting off a chain of events that led to the unauthorized alteration. Now, returned to the palace not for excuses but for the absolute truth, William demanded a closed meeting with his father and stepmother, refusing to let public relations officials turn his personal grief into a managed corporate problem. This was the beginning of an internal constitutional family crisis, a battle not just over ink on a page, but over who truly controls the legacy of Princess Diana and what her memory is allowed to say to future generations. The closed, heavy wooden doors of the private meeting room became the focal point of the entire palace, a physical barrier keeping a dangerous and historic family implosion away from the lower staff and the curious eyes of courtiers. Inside, the heavy atmosphere felt less like a gathering of royals and more like a quiet tribunal, where every look was heavy with years of unspoken resentment and defensive pride. Prince William remained standing for a long moment, even after King Charles motioned for him to take a seat, refusing to give any sign of compliance or comfort to the two people sitting across from him. He adjusted the edges of Princess Diana's private register on the table, treating the document with a deliberate, gentle reverence that stood in sharp contrast to the cold fury radiating from his expression. The king sat with his hands pressed together, his face aged by the sudden realization that the careful peace he had spent decades constructing between his current wife and his eldest son had shattered in a single afternoon. Charles cleared his throat and attempted to assume the role of a stabilizing sovereign, suggesting that the wording change was merely a technical update designed by archivists to prevent future biographers from misinterpreting family dynamics out of context. But William refused to let official palace excuses manage his personal grief, leaning forward slightly as he countered that the replacement phrase was identical to the exact corporate language used by Queen Camilla's personal household office. The Queen Consort herself maintained a tight, controlled posture in her chair, her eyes shifting from the open page to the windows overlooking the courtyard, as if calculating how far the ripples of this confrontation would spread beyond these walls. She spoke softly but firmly, defending her position by stating that while her office had raised legitimate questions about the historical consistency of the records during the Windsor Legacy Review, she had never personally ordered an archivist to alter a single letter of the original text. To William, however, this distinction between direct orders and institutional pressure meant absolutely nothing, because the reality remained that a sacred warning left by his mother had been intentionally softened until it no longer carried its true protective power. He looked directly at Camilla and told her in a voice that was terrifyingly calm that these words did not belong to the current household, nor were they open for modern interpretation, correction, or stylistic polish by anyone looking to ease their own discomfort. Charles tried to intervene once more, choosing each word with extreme caution, explaining that a modern monarchy could not continue to live forever inside the bleeding wounds of the past, and that some phrases from that turbulent era require contextual adjustments to remain helpful for future generations. Hearing his father prioritize institutional convenience over his mother's authentic voice caused a deeper layer of resolve to settle into William's demeanor, making it clear that he was no longer just an angry son throwing a temporary tantrum. He reminded the king that as the heir to the throne and the future guardian of the crown, his duty was not just to preserve the polished image of the family, but to protect the absolute truth of its history, especially when that history belonged to the mother who had been failed by this very institution once before. Outside the heavy doors, Catherine waited in the quiet gallery, her presence a steady anchor of support for her husband, though her mind was actively evaluating the broader consequences this crisis would have on the public trust. She knew that if this internal battle leaked to the press in its entirety, the public would not see a complex debate over archival procedures. They would see a heartbreaking image of a son fighting alone to keep his mother's memory from being erased by palace authority. Inside the room, the confrontation shifted from an argument about guilt to a fundamental struggle over sovereign authority and the future custody of Princess Diana's legacy. William pulled a document from beneath the register, revealing a documented internal access note that proved someone close to the Queen Consort had specifically requested access to the file under the deceptive phrase of household clarification. This evidence completely destroyed the palace's safest defense that the change was a routine mistake made by a faceless clerk, forcing Charles to look at the reality that a quiet boundary had been crossed under his own roof. The king closed his eyes in exhaustion, realizing that his silence during the initial archive review had been perceived by his household as a green light to make the controversial changes, a mistake that had now brought his wife and his heir into a direct, unmanageable collision. William made his final position clear without raising his voice, stating that he would completely refuse to sign or endorse the internal palace summary waiting on the side table, which attempted to frame the entire incident as a harmless administrative update. By rejecting this official summary, the Prince of Wales effectively withdrew his confidence from the internal machinery of the household, turning a private disagreement into a full-scale constitutional family crisis that threatened to divide the loyalty of senior palace staff. He stood up straight, looked at his father one last time, and demanded that the original wording be completely restored and protected under a permanent legal barrier before he would ever consider returning to normal family duties. As he walked toward the door, the sound of his footsteps seemed to echo the absolute end of an era of compliance, leaving Charles and Camilla alone with the realization that the future king would never allow his mother's voice to be managed for corporate comfort. The morning sun rising over London did not bring warmth to the palace, but rather illuminated a battlefield of public opinion that the monarchy was desperately unprepared to fight. By sunrise, fragments of the private confrontation had already escaped the palace walls, turning what began as a silent archival dispute into a national obsession dominated by the single question of who had authorized the alteration of Princess Diana's words. The front pages of the morning newspapers featured large portraits of the late princess side by side with headlines that stripped away all diplomatic language, making it clear to millions of readers that the future king had walked out in defense of his mother's legacy. Palace communications officials moved with frantic speed, drafting multiple statements that attempted to utilize safe, bureaucratic language, framing the entire incident as a routine internal archival correction meant only for administrative consistency. But the public completely rejected this cold, institutional explanation because people did not care about filing procedures or historical guidelines. They cared about a son protecting the final authentic voice of a mother who had already suffered so much within those same stone walls. For Queen Camilla, the sudden public backlash felt like an undoing of decades of meticulous work, a painful reminder that despite her official title, her acceptance by the public remained fragile and easily shaken by the enduring shadow of the past. She watched the televised news commentary from her private sitting room in total silence, listening to royal experts openly question whether her office had overstepped its boundaries by trying to soften words that carried deep emotional weight for the heir to the throne. King Charles found himself trapped in the most challenging position of his reign, realizing that he could no longer treat this as a private family disagreement that could be settled with quiet conversations or managed compromises. He listened as a prominent national broadcaster stated that the crisis was not about ink on an old page, but about whether institutional power possessed the right to rewrite the authentic grief and warnings of history. Outside the gates of Kensington Palace, a quiet but powerful public demonstration began to take shape as supporters started gathering to leave white flowers, candles, and handwritten notes that pleaded with the institution to leave Diana's words alone. This spontaneous emotional response from the public proved that the palace could control the doors, the staff, and the official narratives, but it could never control the deep, unyielding affection the nation still held for the late Princess of Wales. Recognizing that a prolonged public conflict would cause permanent damage to the stability of the monarchy, Charles knew he had to act decisively to restore moral order before the internal fracture became completely unfixable. He met with his senior advisors alone, removing his glasses and looking at the documentation with a heavy heart, finally accepting that the only way forward was to grant his son the absolute victory he demanded. The king officially authorized a sealed preservation order, a binding legal instruction within the royal household that immediately restored Princess Diana's original wording to its rightful place and marked the altered copy as permanently invalid. Furthermore, this preservation order ensured that the private register would be sealed under the direct authority of William's office, erecting a permanent institutional barrier that prevented any future office or household official from ever requesting a contextual adjustment again. When William returned to the palace to witness the formal restoration, he stood before the heavy volume, looking down at the original sentence regarding protection of her sons from future household interference, which was now safely preserved for generations to come. He did not close the register with the sharp, explosive anger the previous day. Instead, he closed the cover gently, his face finally settling into a calm expression, profound relief, and quiet resolve. He knew that this victory was not about personal revenge against his stepmother, nor was a public punishment meant to humiliate his father. It was a fulfillment of a sacred duty he owed to the mother who had guarded him throughout his childhood. Beside him, Catherine offered a quiet smile of affirmation, knowing that by turning his initial fury into a permanent legal protection, William had demonstrated the exact qualities of leadership and dignity required of a future sovereign. The monarchy survived the intense storm, as it always had, but the internal dynamics of the family had been permanently shifted by the confrontation, leaving each member with a clear understanding of the new boundaries. Camilla learned the absolute limit of her institutional influence, realizing that there were certain spaces of memory that would always remain completely beyond her reach, no matter what title she held. Charles recognized that the silence he often used to protect the peace could sometimes carry a cost too heavy for his family to bear, while William walked away as the true, undisputed guardian of his mother's voice. As the palace doors closed once again to protect the family's privacy, the restored words in the archive remained whole, silent, and entirely untouched by the hands of power.